Many warriors had survived, but all were wounded. They stood up and began to approach our boy, who was standing and looking at the ground. His attention was fixed on Jenagu and his eyes widened in surprise. He could not believe that she was saying it was very likely that Cumberland had not died. Jenagu, who had her forehead full of blood and her body full of scratches, began to gaze at the ground with a sad expression and nodded her head. According to her, it was likely that Cumberland was alive. Not far from the area was Agee's starship. Lushing turned around and began to observe it carefully. Jenagu revealed that Agee, the evil spear, left the martial saints on the brink of death and then locked them in his spaceship. But they could not break through the ship's defenses. While Lushing's eyes were shining with determination, he focused and began to stare at the ship, ready to attack. With a calm expression, Lushing attacked with a powerful cutting blast, which destroyed the ship's defenses as if nothing. The eyes of Jenagu and the others filled with surprise and their jaws dropped. They could not believe that Lushing had broken through the spaceship's defenses so easily. With a joyful gaze, Lushing began to observe his hand and couldn't help but smile. According to him, the ship's defenses were strong, but breaking them had been like cracking a nut with his hand. While his eyes were shining with confidence, he extended his hand toward the spaceship and, with a smile, entrusted Jenagu with the mission of rescuing the people, explaining that he had matters to attend to. With a surprised expression, Jenagu struck her fist against her hand and nodded her head. She couldn't believe that Lushing was so powerful. Without wasting any more time, Lushing took momentum and began to ascend into space. All the warriors bowed before our boy and respectfully bid farewell to Lord Lushing. While Lushing's eyes were shining with seriousness, he focused and began to fly quickly. Not long after, with his body surrounded by martial energy, Lushing reached space. Our boy began to observe the blue planet. Seeing that he was stronger than Agee, he came to the conclusion that Agee's leader must be a level 10 warrior, or at most level 11. But it was unlikely that the leader could surpass a level 11 warrior. With a serene gaze, Lushing extended his hand. His power had increased so exaggeratedly that not even he himself was clear on how strong he was now. He closed his eyes and let out a sigh, and remembered that in space there was no air. Breathing, for him, was no longer something necessary but had only become a habit. With a curious look, Lushing began to observe his hand carefully. He reflected that habits could change, like smoking or drinking, and with the reconstruction of his body in star form. In a certain sense, he had completely ceased to be human, having entered into a totally new level of existence. The space was filled with stars. It was beautiful. He could absorb the cosmic energy from the firmament and fully unfold his spiritual form. With eyes shining with determination, Lushing began to emit purple martial energy. Our boy clenched his fists tightly, and his body began to release a huge amount of energy. Compared to the blue star, Lushing's martial spirit was gigantic, and compared to the martial spirit, our boy was like a small ant. He imagined a palm the size of a planet descending from heaven and thought it would be a scene comparable to Buddha's palm subduing sun Wukong. He longed that maybe one day he could come to equal gods and Buddha. Lushing's martial spirit began to gaze to one side. Our boy found one of Agee's companions and hoped that warrior would be level 11. While Lushing's hand was releasing a suffocating aura, his eyes began to shine with excitement. According to him, killing that warrior by crushing him was going to be very boring. An evil smile spread across his face since according to him, for a normal person, it would not be satisfying to kill a mosquito. With a curious gaze, Lushing put his hand under his chin and began to ponder. He decided that, taking advantage of that time, he would reorganize himself a little and also review the supreme treasure that his master had given him. Lushing extended his hand and a small galaxy appeared in his hand, realizing that it was the seat of the material universe on some other civilized planet. It had already gotten dark. This planet looked like Egypt and was full of pyramids. Inside the pyramid, a large number of men bowed before someone in silence. In front of them was the chubby one floating, eating a meat drumstick and drinking a milkshake. Beneath him were treasure chests filled with energy crystals. Still with food remains on his cheek, with an evil gaze, the chubby one began to observe the men and, with an arrogant smile, asked if this was all they had. The king, who was prostrated before him, began to tremble in fear and promised that they had already delivered the entire collection of treasures from their royal house. The chubby one began to observe him in silence. The king had his face full of scratches and was bleeding, with eyes full of fear and desperation. He explained that they had only been able to gather this amount since the guide collected it once every 10 years. The chubby one grabbed the king by the neck. Upon seeing this, the king panicked and started screaming. While foam was emerging from the king's mouth, the chubby one's eyes began to shine with evil and he couldn't help but smile. He asked the king not to try to deceive him, revealing that he was the one who liked violence the least. He threw the king's body, making it crash against a pillar. With an arrogant smile, he decided to forget about this matter since it was almost time to leave. If he delayed a little more, he could end up losing against his friends. The king began to bleed and no longer had strength to move. With a worried expression, the king's daughter came running closer to see if he was okay. With a furious gaze, the father called his daughter stupid and asked why she had gone out, giving her the order to go back into hiding. Upon hearing this, the daughter's eyes filled with tears of sadness. At that moment, the chubby man's hands grabbed the princess by the waist. Upon feeling this, she couldn't help but fall into confusion. He couldn't help laughing like a madman. He couldn't believe that the king had said they no longer had good merchandise. With an evil gaze, he mentioned that the princess was of great value. Upon hearing this, her eyes filled with fear. She couldn't help but cry, knowing that she was in danger. A beam of light began to abduct the chubby one back to his ship. With an arrogant smile, he asked the princess to forget about this planet. With a gaze full of fear and desperation, she began to ask her father for help. The father extended his hand and could only scream and ask him to give his daughter back. Once the chubby one entered his ship, it took off and moved away from the planet. Inside the ship were chests full of energy crystals and the princess tied up and hanging from the ceiling. She closed her eyes and began to cry since according to her he was very cruel. The chubby one who was sitting in his seat contacted his friend using the system window and with a smile asked Ghost how things were on his side. With a serious gaze, Ghost mentioned that everything was going well. They were about to return, but they needed to pay AG a visit. Upon hearing this, the chubby one's mind filled with confusion. He began to gaze toward the window and asked if this was true. Ghost's eyes began to shine with seriousness. Showing a locator, he revealed that AG's signal was fluctuating. He had disappeared, but the spaceship remained in the same place. At the same time, Lushing went into dream space. While the zombies were wandering around, with a serene expression, Lushing began walking through the area. Green space was inside the seed, but the landscape was still as before. The only difference being that at base 1359 where the dream started, everything on this planet had disappeared, leaving only remains behind. Lushing put his hand on his chest and concentrated. He knew that everything that had happened in the past had been destroyed by his mentor and transformed into nutrients that had fused with his martial arts. Lushing activated the system. The ancient resource library still existed, and it was even more powerful. This was because it was no longer necessary to maintain those false images, deduce abilities, predict the future and explore resources, for that was the essence of the power of the resource library. With eyes shining with seriousness, Lushing began to imagine himself from the past, understanding that to speculate about the future, it was the power of the origin of the universe that was at work. The reason there had been a deviation before was simply because too little power from the origin had been mobilized. And the level explored was too superficial, which resulted in an incomplete deduction of information. Lushing began to look at his hand, and a strange energy started to emerge from it. He now possessed all the origin power of this planet, although that only represented such an insignificant amount of the total origin power of the universe that countless zeros would be needed before reaching. Lushing clenched his fists and his eyes began to shine with joy. If he wanted to reach level 16 or even higher in the future and truly wanted to save this universe from disaster, he had to completely refine the origin power of this universe. With an excited smile, Lushing struck his fist against his hand before he could clear a street or a base. But now what he needed was to clear planets one by one, and even planets throughout the entire universe. Since his 10 perfect martial arts required an enormous amount of origin accumulation, Lushing began to float through space with several planets beneath him. He had completely absorbed the essence of that planet, and he did not dare to imagine how magnificent it would be if that reach expanded to the universe, nor how powerful he would be if that day really came. Lushing began to gaze toward the ground, and a smile spread across his face. With an excited expression, Lushing clenched his fist. Perhaps he could truly become the symbolic representative of the word martial arts. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part,